In this tutorial, we are going to take a deeper look into the 4 selectors we introduced earlier and see exactly how they work, when to use them, and why they matter. First, we are going to create the basic HTML structure that will serve as the foundation for our page. Once we have that in place, we'll move into the Style section, where we can start defining how our elements should look. For this example, we are going to create a dot. Sport class. This class will be used to style elements related to sports on our page. We'll set the text color to green and make the font bold by using font weight, bold. This gives us a simple but useful example of how we can create a CSS class and apply styling to HTML elements. Later, we'll see how selectors like this allow us to target specific elements and control their appearance. In this example, we'll explore class selector. A class selector allows us to give a specific name to an HTML element and then use that class name in our CSS to apply styling to it. So let's see how this works with a simple example. First, inside the body of our HTML document, we'll create an H1 heading and call it Hobbies. This will be the main heading for our page and will help us understand what kind of content we are working with. Next, we'll create a div element unassigned at the class Sport. Remember, the class name we use here needs to match the class selector we created earlier in our Style section. In CSS, we identify a class selector by placing a dot before the class name, so our selector is dot. Sport. Inside this div, we'll add 2 pieces of content, reading and football. Now, because this div has the sport class, the styles we define for dot, sport will be applied to its content. For our example, the dot, sport class will make the text green and bold. This shows us the basic relationship between HTML and CSS. We add a class to an HTML element and then we use that class selector in CSS to control how the element looks. This is what makes class selectors so useful. Once we create a class, we can reuse it on multiple elements whenever we want to apply the same styling, instead of writing the same CSS rules over and over again. For our next example, we are going to look at another type of selector, the ID selector. This time, instead of using a class with a dot, we'll use an ID with a number symbol. Inside our Style section, we'll create an ID selector called #degree. We'll use this selector to make the text bold by setting the font weight property to bold. Then, alongside our ID selector, we'll create a class selector called dot. Of course, for this selector, we'll change the font style to the italic using the font style, italic property. This gives us a good opportunity to see the difference between an ID selector and a class selector. The #degree selector is identified with a hash symbol and is intended to target a specific element, while dot, of course, uses a .in, can be reused across multiple elements. So, in our HTML, we can assign the degree ID to the element we want to display in bold, and we can assign the course class to the content we want to display in italics. By combining these 2 selectors, we can apply different styles to different parts of our page and see how CSS gives us precise control over the appearance of our HTML content. First, we'll create an H1 heading inside the body of our HTML document. We'll give this heading an ID of degree, so our HTML will identify it as ID equals degree. The content of this heading will be computer science degree. This gives us a clear example of how we can use an ID selector to target a specific element on our page. Now, because we've given this H1 the ID degree, we can target it from our CSS using the #degree selector. Remember, the number symbol tells CSS that we're working with an ID selector. In our CSS, we can then apply font weight, bold to #degree. As a result, the computer science degree heading will appear in bold. This is a simple example, but it demonstrates how an ID selector connects the HTML element to its specific CSS styling. Next, we'll continue building our HTML structure by creating a div with the class course. This class will allow us to apply the styling we defined earlier using the dot, course selector. Inside this div, we'll add our first paragraph using a P element, and the content will be data science. Then we'll create another div containing a P element with the text cloud systems. Finally, we'll add another div with a P element containing database systems. So, inside our course container, we now have three different course-related pieces of content: data science, cloud systems, and database systems. Because all of these elements are placed inside that of class equals, they will be affected by the styling associated with the dot, course class. In our CSS, we've set the course class to use an italic font style, so these course names will appear in italics. This is another useful example of how we can use a class selector to group related content together and apply the same style to everything within that section. Now, if we open our HTML file in a web browser, we can see the results of the CSS selectors we just created. At the top, we'll see computer science degree displayed in bold. This is because we assign the degree ID to our H1 element N, then use the hashtag degree ID selector in our CSS with font weight, bold. Below that, we'll see our course names such as data science, cloud systems, and database systems displayed in italic. This is because they are contained within the div class equals course and our dot. Course class applies the font style, italic property. So just by looking at the browser, we can clearly see the effect of both selectors. The ID selector is making our degree heading bold, while the class selector is making our course information italic. This is a great way to visualize how CSS selectors connect our HTML structure to the styling we define in the style section. For our next example, we are going to look at an element or tag selector. This type of selector allows us to target an HTML element directly without needing to use a class or an ID. Inside our style section, we'll create an H1 selector. Since we're targeting the H1 HTML tag directly, we simply write H1 followed by our curly braces. Inside the selector, we'll add the font family property and set it to Arial. This tells the browser that we want our H1 headings to use the Arial font. Next, inside the body, we'll add an H1 tag and give it some text, such as tag selector. Because we created a CSS rule specifically for the H1 element, the browser will automatically apply the Arial font to this heading. Notice that we didn't need to add a class or an ID to the H1. The tag selector works directly with the HTML element itself. This is one of the simplest and most useful CSS selectors, because we can style every element of a particular type at once. So if we have multiple H1 elements on our page, the same H1 CSS rule will apply to all of them. For our last example, we are going to look at one of the most powerful and straightforward selectors in CSS, the universal selector. The universal selector is represented by a simple asterisk. Unlike the selectors we've looked at so far, the universal selector doesn't target one specific element, class, or ID. Instead, it targets every element on the page. So, inside our style section, we'll start by writing the asterisk followed by our curly braces. Inside those braces, we'll add font weight, bold. This means that the bold font style will be applied to all the HTML elements on our page. So whether we have a heading, paragraph, div, or another HTML element, the universal selector will target it. Now let's see this in action. Inside our body, we'll create an H1 element N, give it the title universal selector. When we open the page in our browser, we'll notice that the heading appears in bold. And if we add other elements such as paragraphs or divs, they will also inherit the bold styling because the selector applies the rule universally. This is what makes the universal selector different from the other selectors we've covered. With an ID selector, we target one specific element. With a class selector, we can target elements that share a particular class. With a tag selector, we target a specific type of HTML element, such as every H1. But with a universal selector, we are essentially saying apply this style to everything. Of course, we need to be careful when using the universal selector because it can affect a large part of our web page. It's useful when we want to establish a common style or reset certain default browser styles. But we should always consider whether we really want the rule to apply to every element. So to recap our four selectors, we've seen how ID selectors, class selectors, tag selectors, and finally the universal selector allow us to target different parts of an HTML document. Understanding these selectors is an important foundation for working with CSS because they give us the ability to control exactly how our web page looks and behaves. And that brings us to the end of our tutorial on CSS selectors. We explored for important selectors that you'll use frequently when styling HTML pages: the class selector, ID selector, tag selector, and universal selector. Understanding the difference between these selectors is an important first step toward writing cleaner and more effective CSS. As you continue working with HTML and CSS, you'll start combining these selectors to create more detailed and professional web page designs. So remember, classes are reusable. IDs target specific elements, tag selectors target HTML elements, and the universal selector targets everything. Thanks for following along, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.